Joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And I want to remind our listeners now is not the time to be shy. If you have a question, a comment, 651-989-9226, or you can text us. I'll try to get through as many of the texts as I can, 81807. How's the campaign going? How are you holding up?
Oh, it's going great. We're exactly halfway between primary day and election day today. So it was 6 weeks ago, and we got 6 weeks left. So time is flying by, and fitting things in is really, honestly, the difficulty now. And it's constant travel and some fundraising. That's my life, but I'm enjoying it.
Eating a lot of rubber chicken, a lot of those mystery meat meals?
I'm eating a lot of gas station hot dogs, unfortunately.
Avoid the gas station sushi, and you'll be just fine, Jeff. Hey, I have in my hands the Star Tribune from when was this? Sunday morning. Above the fold, Johnson's tax cuts would have a price. How do you respond to that? I mean, you make the point that our taxes are too high and that many businesses that might otherwise settle in Minnesota are perhaps making the decision not to come to Minnesota because of our tax structure. What do you tell people about our tax situation?
Well, and it's not just that businesses aren't choosing to expand here, although I can give you more stories than I can remember about that. But when I look at our taxes, we are overtaxing everybody. It's not just business people in this state. The income tax is the best example. Our highest income tax rate is, I think it's 85% higher than the average highest rate. And that's problematic because it drives out investment and wealth. But my bigger problem, our lowest income tax tier, which applies to anybody who makes over $10,350, I think it is, that lowest tier is actually higher than the highest tier in 23 states. So we aren't just overtaxing CEOs, we're overtaxing school teachers and mechanics and bartenders and everybody else in the state. And that's just the income tax. We're in the top 5 or 8 in like 6 or 7 other major categories. So that this idea that we don't have enough revenue in the state, which I'm hearing from my opponent, is simply false. And when I talk about trying to reduce that tax burden on Minnesotans, there are a lot of places that we can look to make up for that, because I think you have to be honest. You can't just pretend like magically you can cut taxes and you don't have to figure out how to balance the budget. But we can start with the fact that we now have proof from the legislative auditor of waste and fraud that we didn't know about a couple of years ago. They have come up with almost $500 million a year just in programmatic funding of people who aren't eligible for those benefits. I think it's just through 2 different programs. We've seen nearly $100 million in child care fraud. We have seen money that has been paid out in one of the programs to the tune of $40 million a year that they're not even trying to collect, even though it was incorrectly paid out. So some accountability in government will go a long ways to actually giving us some room to reduce the tax burden. But then on top of that, I'm just a strong believer that you start measuring programs and you figure out which ones are working, which ones are actually producing the results we claim we want, and which ones aren't. And the ones that aren't, the ones that just make us feel good as politicians, I think we should look at reducing those.
Jeff, I'm on my 5th weather tech business, small companies. I'd love to see my taxes go down. Who wouldn't? And yet, I'm also sensitive to the fact that people come to Minnesota to enjoy our quality of life. What does that mean? Our transportation system, our education system. We have so many amazing public schools. I went to public school. I'm a believer in public schools. How do we make sure that we cut taxes without, harming our infrastructure, our education system? Can we have our cake and eat it too?
Well, absolutely we can. And, I went to public school too, and both my boys are graduates of public schools. I have a lot at stake there. My wife, his parents, both taught in public schools their entire lives. So, this argument that we need to be one of the highest tax states in the nation, and if we want to provide some reasonable reductions to people, that somehow that's going to slash programs, it's just not true. we've seen a 53% increase in state spending in 8 years. 53% in 8 years. So the thought that there is, no fat, that there's no poor programming, that there's no waste in the system to be found, I think is just inaccurate. And to me, it is all about prioritizing, something that government is not very good at. And let's figure out what are those things that are most important to Minnesotans and make sure that we are funding them better than any state in the country. I believe we should have the strongest safety net in America. I think we actually do right now, and I think we should be proud of that. That is not something that we should be embarrassed about. But I think sometimes we spread this money out so broadly that we don't do some of the basics well enough. For example, I look at what we pay to people who work at group homes with disabled adults. It's pathetic what they're being paid, and we claim, well, there's not enough money to pay them better. That's not true. When we've seen a 53% increase in spending, maybe we should be focusing on some of these most basic things rather than, saying that we're going to fund every program that comes in front of us.
Jeff, I'm the son of an immigrant. He came in legally. He went to college here, found a job, was able to stay. We are a nation of immigrants, descendants of immigrants. I love it when people lecture me about legal immigration. I gently remind them, unless you have Sioux or Apache or Comanche blood, please don't lecture me about immigration. Now, illegal immigration, safe borders, securable borders, that's a whole different ballgame, at least in my mind. I want to give you a chance to weigh in on something. We have a huge population of Somali immigrants in the state of Minnesota. Most of them refugees, all of them refugees. They were fleeing untenable conditions in Africa. I want to give you a chance to answer the question, what positive impacts do Somali immigrants bring to the state of Minnesota?
Oh, I think that I think all immigrants. I mean, my great grandparents were immigrants as well, and I think all immigrants add to Minnesota. We have amazing success stories. I've got some Somali immigrants who are working on my campaign that have great stories to tell about the little small businesses that they started. I know a lot of Somalis that are entrepreneurs. They came here because they saw opportunity in Minnesota and in America that they didn't have where they came from. My concern about the refugee resettlement program in particular is that we are seeing, particularly in the Somali community, a very large number that are not achieving the American dream. The employment rate among Somali men in Minnesota is, the last number I saw was in the 40s, but that was a couple of years ago. Maybe it's in the 50% range, where we have almost no unemployment in the state of Minnesota. So something is not working right with that program. And my thought is, rather than let's just continue and hope things get better, maybe we should step back and say, why aren't these people achieving the American dream the way we want them to, and see if there's something we can do about that.
Jeff, can you hang on the line and take a couple of questions when we come back?
Yeah, absolutely.
Terrific. More with Jeff Johnson when we come back on CCO. Jeff Johnson is joining us, candidate to be the next governor of Minnesota. Please keep your questions brief so we can get as many of these in as possible. Ross in Stacy, do you have a question for Mr. Johnson?
I do. I'll ask my question and hang up, please, and listen to the answer. Thank you. If elected, Governor Johnson, will you push for right to work in Minnesota? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I won't push for it, but I'm always honest with people. I would, if the right to work bill landed on my desk, I would sign it. I can almost guarantee you that's not going to happen because I've talked to leadership in both the Senate and the House, and they have no interest in moving forward with that. The Janus decision, which the Supreme Court brought down, actually addressed my biggest concern about right to work, and that was with respect to public employees, because we were talking about taxpayer dollars, and I would argue a free speech issue there. So it's not going to be something that I would push, no.
All right. Quick text question, Jeff. Why do you keep being so prohibitive? Why are you anti-weed? when 50% of Minnesotans apparently want it legal. I'm voting for Walz just for this reason, and I'm conservative. How would you answer that question?
Well, I mean, that's one of the beauties of America. You can base your vote on whatever you want. I've got a much stronger liberty bent, I would argue, than my opponent on the other side. But I always do weigh the costs versus the liberty benefit, if you will. And there are costs. There are significant costs. And I think if you take an honest look at states where they have legalized marijuana, recreational use of marijuana, by the way, I've always supported medicinal use. You look at Colorado, for example, the costs to society have been significant. And I am not convinced that the benefits outweigh the costs. And again, I'm also not one who says, well, I'm going to take a poll on every issue, and that's where I will land. I'm hoping that's not what people want in their governor, someone who sticks his finger in the wind and says, well, I used to believe this, but now 53% of Minnesotans want that, so I'll do that. I am always going to base my decisions on what I think is best for the state of Minnesota, and probably there will be times where I might buck the trend, but people will always know where I'm at, and I don't hide the ball.
Bruce in Ramsey, do you have a question for Jeff Johnson?
Yes, Mr. Johnson. I am actually going to ask the question, then hang up. My question is regarding your stance on health care in the state of Minnesota. We've heard lots of rumors about you cutting out health care to the low income and to the middle income, and I would like to know where you stand on that.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to that, because the rumors you hear are simply a commercial that a far left group has put out. In fact, they've spent a couple $1 million on that ad, and it is a perfect example of the belief that if you tell a lie enough times, people will start believing it. And what the ad says is Jeff won't cover people with pre-existing conditions anymore, and I think 300,000 people will lose their insurance. It's actually a template ad that they are using everywhere, all over the United States against Republicans. It doesn't really matter what your view is. I have made it crystal clear, if you go to my website, or even if you went there a year and a half ago when I first put it up, I said that we will continue to cover people with pre-existing conditions in Minnesota. It's something we've done for decades. It's just a value that we have here to take care of people who need help. We did it long before the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, required us to do it, and we'll be doing it for many, many years to do that if I'm governor. And this belief that somehow, Minnesotans are going to lose health insurance if I'm governor, to be honest with you, I'm not even sure what that's based on. I have made it clear that I don't intend to try to reverse the Medicaid expansion. I think in general that has expanded our coverage, not a lot in Minnesota, because we had the fewest number of uninsured before the ACA, and now we're a little more towards the middle of the pack, but it has added some people at the cost of the federal government. I'm fine with that. The more people covered, the better. Where we really need to go with insurance, though, is once we make sure people who need help are covered, then we got to look at the other 85% of the state of Minnesota, the folks who either pay for their own insurance in the individual market or get their insurance through their employer and pay for part of it themselves, because that 85% of the population is absolutely getting hammered and has been getting hammered for the last decade, even longer than that, both before and after the ACA. We are seeing premium increases that have literally bankrupted people in the individual market. And nobody on, no one on the other side seems to have any response to that, other than Tim Walz saying we need government-run health insurance in a single-payer system. To me, it's exactly the opposite of what we need to do for those who have their own insurance, and that is give them more options, force more competition into the system, bring more accountability and transparency to the system so people actually know what things cost, and start rolling back some of the mandates. So, if people want to buy a flexible benefit plan, government doesn't get to say, no, we know better. We'll allow you to do that.
Okay. Jeff Johnson, thank you for joining us. We appreciate this. We hope to have you on, as well as Tim Walz, a couple of times between now and Election Day. Good luck with your campaign, and thanks for taking our calls. Thanks for taking our questions.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I appreciate it.
You bet. Tim Walz is coming